to have I'm really excited to have Dr. Robert Kopp with us today. He is a climate scientist and also co-director of the Rutgers University Office of Climate Action. He is very much a leader in the space of climate, and given who we are and where we are at Rutgers, I know climate justice is very much top of mind. And so I will hand it over to Bob. Thank you again for joining us. We're really delighted to have you here, and we look forward to you opening up the track for this afternoon.
Thank you, Noah. And thanks to all of you for tuning in as you come back from your lunch break. So this track is focused on the theme of climate justice. So I wanted to start by talking about how I see this concept. So in my mind, climate justice starts with the recognition that the world, and this is, I have a little bit of a US-centric perspective, but I think you'll find this everywhere, are facing multiple intertwined crises right now. So putting aside the urgent and ongoing pandemic crisis, which has many parallels to and sort of projects on the ones I want to talk about two: the climate crisis and the crisis of democracy. But first, the climate crisis. As I'm sure you all know, since the end of the Cold War, humans have put nearly 900 billion tons of fossil carbon into the atmosphere. And as a consequence, humans have raised global temperatures by about 0.7 of a degree Celsius. As a consequence of that, we're seeing more intense, frequent, and deadly heat waves. We're seeing more intensive and destructive flooding. And for those of us who are in New Jersey, I think many of us will have fairly fresh memories of Hurricane Ida's flooding just this past September. We're also seeing more extended and extensive droughts and more extensive wildfires. All of these are hazards that are fairly strongly tied to climate change. And we also know that to stabilize the climate, humankind needs to bring our net carbon dioxide emissions to zero. There is no positive level of net carbon dioxide emissions that are compatible with a stable climate. Every ton of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere makes climate change a bit more severe. And the longer we take getting to net zero, the greater the amount of warming and the more destructive climate change will be. To meet the international goal adopted in the Paris Climate Accord of limiting warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, we need to get to net zero around the middle of this century. So that's the climate problem, at least the carbon element of the climate problem. What about the climate justice aspect? Well, there are multiple justice issues interwoven with the climate crisis. So one aspect of climate justice is distributive justice. There is distributive justice or distributive injustice at the heart of climate change. So on the one hand, the emissions of carbon dioxide, both past and future, or past and current, rather, are disproportionately caused by the wealthier people on the planet. According to the World Inequality Lab, about 10% of the global population is responsible for about half of global emissions. And within the US, the top 10% of earners emit about as much as 3.5 million Americans. On the other hand, work by many, including our work in the Climate Impact Lab, which is a group I'm involved with, a collaboration among Chicago, Berkeley, Rhodium Group, and Rutgers focused on the economic risks of climate change. That work shows that both within the United States and across the world, climate impacts fall disproportionately on lower income populations. The poor largely suffer the harms of climate change, while the wealthy largely have costs that are mostly money spent to avoid the worst harms. So that's a real issue of distributional injustice. Second, the democratic crisis. Democratic countries in general, and this certainly includes the United States, are more internally polarized and unequal than they were 30 years ago. Intense partisan polarization combined in the US with archaic and veto-ridden institutional structures make our country particularly prone to failures of governance that make it hard to respond to crises like climate and COVID. For example, how are we going to effectively limit climate change if we cannot even agree to fund improved indoor ventilation amidst an ongoing pandemic driven by respiratory virus? A pandemic, I should add, whose ongoing deaths at this stage using standard valuation approaches cost the US about $7 billion a day. How are we going to effectively adapt to climate impacts also when it takes years after a crisis like Hurricane Maria to authorize and fully dispense recovery funds? Now, much of democracy is about procedural justice, ensuring that parties impacted by hard decisions feel that there is due process that respects their voices. And we are at a time of weakened trust in our deliberative forums in our countries, which hinder our ability to make hard decisions nationally and within the states. According to Pew, in the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, about 3/4 of Americans said they could trust the national government to do the right thing most of the time. Today, about a quarter do. 25 years ago, 2/3 of Americans had a good deal of confidence in the wisdom of the American people in making political decisions. In 2019, the last time Pew asked that question, about 1/3 did. US citizens increasingly see electoral victory by the other party as an existential threat to democracy, which perspective that bodes ill for democratic solutions to major societal crises. The climate justice framing recognizes that the climate crisis and the democracy crisis have to be addressed together. We're not going to be able to effectively respond to climate change without addressing the low trust in our democratic institutions. But yet there is no silver bullet for either the climate crisis or the democratic crisis. Both require a polycentric approach. And I think this is something that public universities have a duty, a place somewhere that public universities have a duty and a capacity to take a leading role. Despite declining trust in higher education as a sector, specific public universities generally have a high degree of support within their states. And universities structurally are particularly well suited to help society tackle crises like climate that require sustained attention with consequences that play out over decades. Universities, which have a generation spanning mission, that have students who are starting their careers now, who are going to be our alumni for decades, that have faculty who are going to be here for decades. Universities are among the best suited secular institutions we have for challenging short-termism. And that's why I'm proud of the vision laid out in Rutgers' Climate Action Plan, which was developed through a nearly 2-year process that engaged hundreds of members of the Rutgers community and was adopted last fall by President Holloway, who you'll hear from tomorrow. The Climate Action Plan doesn't just commit the Rutgers to eliminate our own net emissions by 2040 and improve our own resilience. It calls upon Rutgers to lean into our role as the public land-grant University of New Jersey in order to advance climate positive, sustainable, and equitable economic development across the entire state. That means leveraging the university's mitigation and adaptation actions to foster scholarship and teaching that both advance fundamental insights and directly benefit communities in the state. That means partnering with communities and businesses to advance such community-engaged climate scholarship, and to leverage our economic weight as a community of 100,000 students, faculty, and staff, and an organization with a $5 billion budget to address the twin crises of climate and democracy, and thus to advance climate justice. My challenge to you all is to take that spirit into your work as scholars and ask, can my research identify solutions to the societal barriers to mitigation and adaptation? Am I evaluating my proposals by their impacts on distributive and procedural justice? Can my work lead to solutions that are both climate and democracy positive? We are in a time of reckoning. Crises seem to happen and cascade upon one another every day. By the end of the decade, with respect to the climate crisis, it'll be clear whether the international climate goals remain within reach, or whether we are on our path to blow past the 2°C milestone. And it'll likely also be clear whether we're able to reverse the global advance of authoritarianism and the retreat of democracy. With so much at stake, we cannot wait for top-down solutions. And I urge you all to consider how, as citizens and as researchers, you can advance climate justice and help tackle the climate and democracy crises in your work, in your workplaces, and in all the communities to which you belong. Thank you.
Thank you so, Bob, for that inspiring call to action. I really appreciated what you had to say about the role of universities as kind of a way to prevent short-termism through research and connection to students. And I really appreciate your time. And so would like to invite everyone to join us in a couple of minutes on a session on CEO activism. So please join us for that next. Thank you again, Bob.